Although I love old Scottish customs and beliefs, I am happy to say that many of the crueler practices found in the old feudal laws, which covered the highlands and islands, have long since faded into the past. You see, at that time, the great Highland chiefs held the power of life and death over their subjects and vassals. This helped to control the land, feed its people, and punish the wicked. But there were many times that an unscrupulous man would become laird or landowner within the chief's realm, and use the power of the chief to his own corrupt ends. Opposing such a law would be opposing the chief himself, and would incur severe punishment, and on many occasions, death. Sure, there were national laws set forth by the King of Scotland, which would render this abuse of power illegal. But then, much like today, the political powers of Edinburgh and Glasgow cared more for the prosperity of the Central Belt than the lives and deeds of the isolated Highlanders. This would result in unfair and unethical laws being put in place throughout the far reaches of the country. One in particular would be the claiming of the best horse on the farm when a farmer dies. Let me explain this a little more. When the tenant or farmer would pass away, this fact must be immediately related to the laird of the land, or owner of the property. In many areas, the time frame was given as 3 days, after which a great penalty would be incurred. Once notified, the laird would send a messenger to the widow, demanding that the finest horse on the farm be delivered to the laird, whom recognised it as his legal property and payment due to the untimely death of the farmer. This messenger would commonly arrive on the funeral day, and was near universally hated by all farm widows, rich and poor alike. If the demand was refused, or the widow attempted to evade this taxation, then by local law they would forfeit all their land, their house, their goods, and their cattle to the laird. On large farms, where the owners had made a good living, the demand of a horse was only a temporary financial burden, and most likely there were many other animals to take its place. But where we see the true cruelty of this law is in those smaller and poorer farms. It was frequently true that these farmers had only one horse, which they used to work the land, and so the loss of this animal would condemn the very farm itself, leaving the widow and the children with no food, home, or work, damning them to a life of poverty, or even death at the hands of a cold Scottish winter. But today, we tell the story of one who fought against this injustice, and would change Scotland forever. Mackinnon's Revenge. At the beginning of the 17th century, in a small plot of land on the Isle of Skye, a young farmer died very unexpectedly while working in his field. His wife and small child were horrified by the sudden death, and were both drawn into a deep grief. Knowing the laws of the land, the wife sent word to the local laird, informing him of her husband's death, and announcing the day of the funeral. True to form, the laird's unwelcomed messenger arrived on the very day of the burial, just as the widow and her fatherless son returned home. The widow was in some distress, as she told the messenger that they had only the one horse, and it was the animal that pulled the plough over their meagre stretch of land. Not only that, but her husband had been kin of the local chief, and surely her and her son would be granted some sympathy from the ruler of these lands, even allowing them to keep the horse until another could be paid for. But the heartfelt pleas of the widow only made the messenger more determined to take the animal. The woman again tried to appeal her position, and begged the man to take her case to the chief, who would surely understand. The messenger became more and more enraged by the woman's refusal, and soon his vicious words turned to vicious blows. The laird's man savagely beat the woman while pushing aside her small child. Eventually, when the woman was left upon the floor, silent and bleeding, the messenger took the horse and left. The poor child ran to his mother's side, traumatized by the violence and savagery he had beheld. Holding his mother close, the boy would hear her whisper these very words: "Thou art not a son like the father, my young Lachlan, unless thou requite with blood the ill treatment of thy mother, and unless thou dash to death with due revenge this fierce and savage fellow, this bare-faced murderer." With that said, the life slowly left the mother as she was cradled in the arms of her beloved son. After these horrifying events, life on the Isle continued in much the same manner as it always had, and the cruel laws continued to be practised. But as for the now orphaned boy, Lachlan Og Mackinnon, he was taken in by a neighbouring family who worked their own farm nearby, and would now work the Mackinnon land until the boy was old enough to do so himself. The money made from his father's farm would pay to feed him and allow a small recompense for the neighbours who Lachlan had grown to love. Eventually, the boy would become a man, known in the area for his strong will and great agility. He would leave his adoptive parents and return to rebuild his old home. But then on one day, a tragedy would befall his adoptive father, who was struck down with a great illness, which would eventually take his life. Again, word was sent to the laird. Later that same day, while the young man worked his father's land, he saw the laird's messenger come up the path to his neighbour's home and demand her only horse. Lachlan knew his face well. It was a face etched into the man's very soul. For 25 years, he had been plagued by the nightmarish images and visions of the man who had murdered his mother. And not only that, he remembered well her dying words. Lachlan swiftly moved to the end of the path and waited for the messenger to return with the horse. As the messenger led the horse down the path, the great figure of Lachlan leapt forth and took the man by the neck. He demanded the return of the horse, which the messenger quickly let free. He then reminded the messenger of the Mackinnon wife he murdered many years ago. The old messenger now stood petrified with fear, seeing the savage rage in the eyes of the powerful young man. As the messenger went for his blade, Mackinnon grasped him by the hair and, seizing his dirk, removed the old man's head from his body. As the decapitated figure fell to the ground, Lachlan marched with the head to a well by the path. There he would stand and wash the blood from the face of the man. The determined and rage-filled Lachlan then mounted the horse and galloped with all speed to the residence of the chief. There he would bang upon the castle door with both dirk and head. The servants in the castle were horrified to see the appalling sight, and quickly inquired about his business. "Go and tell your chief Mackinnon that I have arrived to present him with the head of his messenger, Donnacha Moore, in case that he might wish to embalm it and hang it up in his baronial hall as a trophy of heartlessness and cruelty." The man's purpose was quickly brought to the chief's attention, who could not believe that such a hideous deed could have been perpetrated by any of his kin. He ventured forth instantly, and as he arrived at the main door, the young man offered the head on the blade of his dirk. "What is this madness?" called the chief. Lachlan explained the whole terrifying tale to the man, the inhuman treatment of his mother, her murder, the poverty and cruelty his laws forced upon the people. The chief seemed somewhat taken aback, and paused in thought for a great while. Eventually, he would tell Lachlan that these cruelties had been committed in his name, but without his knowledge. The Mackinnon chief apologised to Lachlan, and as compensation gave him a pardon for the murder, and granted him the lands and titles not only of Donnachamúr, but also those of the unscrupulous laird as well, before issuing an edict that no longer would this cruel law exist in his lands, and neither widow nor orphan would be deprived of their property again. Lachlan, now as the new laird of the land, would ensure that the chief kept to his promise, and in his official position as both laird and messenger, he would never take a horse from a family again. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to my wonderful patrons for supporting the channel and allowing me to bring you these videos. I hope you all enjoyed this tale of injustice and revenge. There have been hundreds of strange laws in place over the years, some due to the beliefs of the time, which in hindsight seem very strange to us, and others the work of corruption in the justice system, which unfortunately seems to be an eternal issue, born by the very having of a justice system. This tale seems to be somewhat mythical, as there is not much evidence of it occurring, and the tale only appearing in a few sources that I could find. The law itself seems to have actually been put in place in multiple areas of Scotland, and it's possible this tale is of a true occurrence, altered by the continuous retellings over the years. The well in which the head was washed is known in Skye as the Well of the Head, which is linked to many wells and areas throughout the island, and honestly, I am unsure exactly which well it is. I would also mention that the practice of washing a severed head in a well is a fairly common trope in Scottish folklore. There has always been some significance with wells and heads. Throughout ancient Celtic traditions, human heads or skulls were used as cups to offer water to the Sidhe or gods. And this practice and tradition seems to have found its way through to Christianity as well, where in Scotland water from a holy well is consumed from a skull by pilgrims that travel the land, or at least it was many years ago. I hope you all join me again next time for more tales of Scottish folklore, and until then, Stange va.